Can I get your name?
Certainly, it's Myron Hitch.
Okay, Myron, and your law enforcement career. Can you give me an idea of ultimately who you worked for?
Yes, I'm a retired FBI agent. I entered on duty with the FBI in 1964, and I retired in 1988.
Okay. And can you give me an idea of growing up? How was your family life, and maybe what in your family life or what in your schooling ultimately brought you to the FBI?
Okay, it's an interesting question because no one in my family worked in law enforcement, at least that I'm aware of. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. My family moved to Southern California when I was 10 years old in 1947. My dad was a manager of battery companies, production actually. My mom was a housekeeper. I mean, she was a housewife. There was really nothing in my background that was related to law enforcement. My background was very stable. Mom and Dad were outstanding human beings. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles and a community called Linwood. I actually graduated from Linwood High School in 1955. The first probably indication formally that I wanted to go into law enforcement occurred in high school when in an English class, senior English class, we were required to write a term paper, and the subject matter for the term paper was, what do you want to do for a career? Well, I wrote about I wanted to be an FBI agent. And it's kind of interesting because probably my only exposure prior to that, being a high school senior, was the radio, really, because even in those days, television was in its infancy when I was in high school. As I grew up, it was radio, and I used to listen to shows on the radio about the FBI. And the key to my upbringing was fairly simple, really. I just wanted to be one of the good guys who put bad guys in jail. That was most of the motivation that I had. It just was the way I was raised. And from that point on, everything basically I did was directed towards a career in the FBI. When I say that, I mean, I wasn't foolish. It's very difficult to get in the FBI. It's not only difficult, it requires certain qualifications, which later on I'll explain how I screwed up with one aspect of that. But when I say screwed up, I was talking about I qualified to be an agent years before I actually applied, but I didn't know it at the time. And so that was a minor screw up. But like I said a few minutes ago, everything I did was directed to be an agent, and the only break was I was a naval officer on active duty from 1960 to 1963, which was required because of my military obligation. And it was also something that I just believed I had to do. I mean, I could have avoided active duty by staying in the reserves, but I literally wanted to go on active duty as an officer. So there was a break in that transition period before the FBI where I was in the Navy as an officer, and then I went to law school for a year and a half.
Okay. Once you graduate, did you graduate from law school?
No, and that's the interesting story. And I may as well, tell it quickly. I completed my naval service, and I really enjoyed my 3 years on active duty as a naval officer. Matter of fact, I was a navigator of a attack troop transport. We carried Marines, and I navigated that ship around the world. I actually navigated the globe as a young 23-year-old ensign, which was, I mean, it's incredible. And I loved my 3 years in the Navy, but there was no time that I ever intended to make it a career. I thought about it because they wanted me to come back after I got out. But when I got out of the Navy in 1963, I started law school at UCLA Law School. Because at that point, even though I had this desire to be an FBI agent, I'd never been interviewed or gone into an FBI office to talk to them about the process. So I started law school and I finished the first year. And at the end of the first year, they had a career day on campus and the FBI was going to be there. So I said, well, I was accelerating through law school in that the plan was to go straight through during the summers. So I would graduate in like 2.5 years. So in the spring of 1963, it would have been, 1964. I'm sorry. In the spring of 1964, I went to the career day at UCLA and interviewed and talked to the FBI agent. And I told him I was in law school and I was going to graduate in probably a year and a half based on my plans to accelerate. And he said, well, he asked me what I did prior to law school. I said, well, I was an officer in the Navy for 3 years. And he kind of looked at me funny and he said, son, you already qualify to apply to be an FBI agent. What I didn't realize, and that was the mistake I made in my career, I should have talked to somebody in the FBI, that even though they normally required you to be either a lawyer or an accountant to be an FBI agent, they allowed 3 years of administrative experience to satisfy those degrees. So I already qualified. So he asked me what I wanted to do. I said, well, give me the application. Well, I finished 2 summer sessions at law school. So I was almost a year and a half through law school. And in the fall of 1964, I received a telegram from J. Edgar Hoover offering me an appointment in the FBI at $4,800 a year.
Okay, it looks like you started your career with the FBI in the Denver division, right?
Well, as all agents, you go to new agents training at Quantico, Virginia, which is the academy, the FBI academy. Although in the fall of 1964, when I went there wasn't much of an academy. I mean, we were on the Marine base. We actually had an old barracks building that we lived in, and there were some classrooms, and we transitioned between Quantico and those barracks, and we had apartments in downtown, and we would attend classes in the old post office building, which is kind of famous today because Trump bought it actually and remodeled it. I'd like to see it, but so in 1964, I did training at Quantico and in downtown Washington at the old post office buildings. The reason we stayed at Quantico part-time was the ranges were the one thing that haven't changed much at Quantico. There were outstanding ranges, firearms ranges in 1964 at Quantico that were part of the FBI facility that have actually gotten even better today. But that was one of the reasons that we spent time at both locations.
Can you tell me, at that time when you went through the FBI Academy, how long was the training and what did the training entail?
Well, it was roughly 14 weeks, and it was mostly academic. There was a little bit of physical training. There was a lot of firearms, a lot of defensive tactics, but it was primarily academic. I mean, it was we learned how the FBI was run, constitutional law, which I'd already learned in law school, by the way, so that was not something that I needed. But it was good training. I'm sure it's much better. Luckily, because I spent a fair amount of time at the academy over the years, not only as a student, but I would go back later on when I ran the LA FBI SWAT team as a counselor to some of the SWAT classes where I'd actually instruct. And it developed into one of the finest law enforcement academies, literally in the world.
So you go through the academy, and how was it that you ended up in Denver? Was it just was that a choice of yours, or that was assignment?
Yeah, no, it was not a choice at all. It was totally random. Matter of fact, Hoover did some interesting things administratively, and some of which I agreed with in the 1960s. He would send agents, particularly agents from like the East Coast, and I'm talking about New York, Boston, or agents from the Deep South, to offices that were totally different from where they would grow up. Now, when you're somebody like me from LA, which is not really, LA is just a big spread out metropolitan area. It's unlike probably any other major city. In my case, they sent me to Denver. Which turned out to be a good choice, by the way, because it was a good office. The rule in those days was when you graduated, they would send you to a small or medium-sized office for exactly 1 year. And then after that year, you would go to a large office that was in the opposite direction from where you were from. And what I'm referring to is specifically and I'll give an example. A lot of agents from New York City would go to Los Angeles. In my case, there's no way I would go to Los Angeles after that 1 year. And in my case, I went to Chicago, which is, again, a great office to work in.
So what was your first year like in Denver? What did they teach you? What did you focus on?
Well, general crime, general reactive crime. An office the size of Denver, which is a medium-sized FBI office, there wasn't a lot of specialized squads. There were a few agents that handled some special, like security work, foreign counterintelligence, stuff like that. But as a young agent, you would mostly work criminal matters, applicants. In those days, we worked a lot of 42s, which were deserters. The Vietnam War was going on. There were a lot of young men that were drafted and didn't want to stay in the service. So we chased deserters all over the country. But I worked a lot of theft from interstate shipment, crime on a government reservation, a little bit of everything. I mean, and as a young agent, you wouldn't get a major case. I mean, you'd get fairly routine cases trying to give you some background so that hopefully you would round out and become a good agent. Luckily, in Denver, I had a couple really great mentors who helped me a lot. And I had a partner who also, that I work with most of the time, that was really a good friend and a good colleague. And we got along well and worked well together.
Okay. So then after Denver, you ended up going to Chicago from 1965 to 1967. Was there more of a focus on specific things at that point? Or
yeah, definitely. Matter of fact, when I originally went to Chicago, a big office, they literally, except for your personnel file, they don't know much about you. So, I mean, even though I wanted to work reactive crime, I wanted to work fugitives and bank robbery and whatever, they put me on a security squad, which was, I mean, really boring. I think initially the first squad I was on may have been the Polish surveillance squad, because there was a Polish consulate in Chicago. and it was not very exciting work. It was pretty boring. Luckily, I wasn't on that squad very long, but I transitioned to a security squad, which was Communist Party work, and I don't remember how long I was on that squad, but again, it wasn't too long. And then luckily, my third assignment, I was on the fugitive squad, and things picked up pretty good from that point on. I enjoyed the hell out of. I mean, we busted a lot of fugitives in Chicago in the 1960s. Matter of fact, I remember one time we arrested 5 fugitives in one day, and for a very short time had the record on the squad. Me and my partner, Dick Zedek is his name. He's last I heard he was in Florida. But another team of agents, two black agents, Ed Scott and John Housley, they one day picked up 7 fugitives in one day to beat our 5, which was, incredible. You're literally hitting an address, taking the guy to jail, or in the case of a deserter, you're taking him to the military provost, and you're going back to the office and going out again, and it was fun. I mean, for a young 25-year-old, 26-year-old FBI agent, it was just some of the greatest work that I ever did.
Okay. So from, let's see, 65 to 67, you were in Chicago, and then what happens? Do you actually end up, I don't necessarily know how it goes. Do you volunteer to go to LA, or are you physically, do they say, you're going to LA?
No, let me before we get to LA, let me back up before we get to LA, and there's a reason. I think it was 1966, I attended my first in-service at Washington, D.C., which was required every 2 years. Agents go back for a 2-week in-service throughout their career, sometimes specialized. For a young agent like I was, the first in-service is just a general in-service. It's not any specific training or anything that's really out of the ordinary. I mean, it's a lot of review. I wasn't at that time tremendously happy in Chicago as far as staying there for the rest of my life and not knowing where I would go after Chicago if I got transferred. So I did something that very few agents did. When you went back for an in-service like that, J. Edgar Hoover gave his agents the ability to request a personal interview, that you could actually go in during the in-service, and meet and talk with the director of the FBI. And everybody in the FBI had that option. The problem with that is it was a career killer. And what I mean by that, if you chose to go in and meet Hoover and talk to him, and he didn't like you, or he didn't like what he saw, your career was pretty much over. Well, my wife and I, we've been married, we'll be married, we're in our 60th year. We're happily married, but we're not that keen on spending the rest of our life in Chicago. I wasn't sure if I was interested in administrative advancement in the Bureau at that point. So I decided that I would meet J. Edgar Hoover and talk to him. Now, 90% or more of all FBI agents, the only time they meet J. Edgar Hoover is when they are in new agents training and they walk through his office and shake his hand, I'm sorry. And I had done that in 1964. But this was very, very different. In 1966, you actually go into his office and sit down one-on-one, and you talk to the man for as long as he wants to talk to you. In my case, he talked to me for probably 45 minutes. It was pretty much a one-way conversation. Most agents who do this, when I say it's a career killer, most agents that request an audience with J. Edgar Hoover at that time want something. Either they have a hardship with their family, they want to transfer. So the first question Mr. Hoover asks you when you go into this meeting is, what do you want? Why are you here? Well, in my case, I told him there wasn't anything I want. I mean, I just wanted to meet the director of the FBI, who was one of my heroes. So Mr. Hoover would talk a lot. I mean, he was, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there wasn't a lot of two-way dialogue, in that he talked a lot about problems that he knew I was from Los Angeles. The chief of police was a man named Parker at that time in Los Angeles. Hoover and Parker didn't get along, so he talked a little bit about Parker, but it was pretty much it. I mean, I finished the interview. I don't know what happened. The rumor in the Bureau was that when you left an interview with Hoover, he wrote something in your file and it went back to your office. Well, when I went back to Chicago, interestingly enough, I must have done okay, because they wanted to know if I wanted to become a relief supervisor. Well, at that point, I wasn't sure what a supervisor in the FBI did. And I mean, I don't want to sound stupid. I mean, I knew generally what they do. So I said, what the heck? I'll become a relief supervisor. So I became a relief supervisor in Chicago, and actually was assigned to a number of squads as a relief supervisor. I worked as the night supervisor in Chicago, and there was a possibility that before I received the transfer to LA, that I could have been one of the next supervisors in the Chicago division, with like maybe 3 or 4 years in the Bureau, which is almost unheard of. The only problem with that, when I say that, I'm talking about what I learned. What I learned is that supervisors in the FBI don't supervise squat. They supervise paper. And I wanted to put people in jail and work the streets, not supervise paper. Well, about the time that I was probably going to have to make a decision whether I wanted to stay in Chicago and become a supervisor, the SAC in Los Angeles justified and asked for 100 agents to be assigned to the LA office. Now, in the FBI, there's an officer preference system in which you list the top 3 offices that you would like to be in, and as you build up seniority, you ultimately can get a transfer to these locations. Well, at that time in the 1966, 1967, it took at least 10 years of service to get to an office like Los Angeles. But because he asked for 100 agents, and I was on the Los Angeles officer preference list, in the fall of 1967, I got an officer preference transfer to Los Angeles. So it was, and that's where I spent, the rest of my career until I retired in 1988. It was just pure dumb luck, and it was almost unheard of. Agents with I had almost 3 years in at the time. Agents with a little over a year and a half were getting officer preference transfers to Los Angeles, where for years it had taken 10, 12, 15 years to get there.
Was there some sort of push that Hoover was pushing to try? What did he find so important about LA that he was putting agents there at the time?
Just LA was exploding population-wise, and just the work was there. It wasn't they just needed that many agents to increase the size of the LA office.
And once you got to LA, I'm assuming as you become more and more senior, you can kind of pick and choose the kind of cases that you wanted to do. But what did you work on when you were in LA?
Well, it was funny. One of the squads I was on in LA that I think they thought I did a bang up job on, was the racial squad, which was, I didn't really enjoy the work that much. So when I first got to LA, because I'd been on the racial squad in Chicago, Racial Matters was the title of the work we did. They put me on that squad. Well, it was kind of interesting. In Chicago, it was actually a fairly busy squad because there was a lot of activity in Chicago that related to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In LA, it was kind of a nothing squad. I mean, there literally was not much going on. Now, I got there in, I believe, September of 1967. And during that couple months that I was on that racial squad, the LA office built up the bank robbery squad. It actually increased to 2 squads of almost 50 guys, 25 agents per squad. And I volunteered to go on one of those 2 squads. So early in 1968, after I'd been on the racial squad, I was assigned to one of the 2 bank robbery squads in Los Angeles in early 1968, and I pretty much stayed on that squad until I took over the SWAT team in 1979.
Any interesting stories from on the bank robbery squad?
Well, I mean, there are a lot. Let me tell. I've furnished you a list of. I've received 15 personal letters of commendation from the director of the FBI. Now, when I was in the FBI, personal letters from J. Edgar Hoover, or I've got them from Pat Gray and Ruckelshaus and whoever, was probably one of the highest honors that you could get in the FBI. And I'm going to back up just a little bit because I'm going to tell a quick story about my first letter of commendation. Actually was in Chicago. And it's kind of an interesting story in that I'm going to bounce around, and I hope I'm clear because it makes sense when I put it all together. As a first office agent in Denver, I arrested a parole or probation violator. And it was no big deal, just a very routine arrest, put the guy away. In Chicago, when I was working, I think I may have been on the racial squad at the time. I went out for coffee with another agent in downtown in the Loop. And in those days, and that was one of Hoover's rules, you didn't drink coffee on the job. There was no coffee in the office, and you weren't supposed to stop at a coffee shop before you went out and did your work. But all the agents did. Well, that morning, myself and the other agent, I won't mention his name, he later became I think his assistant director, and he thought he wasn't going to have a job after that day, and I'll tell you why. We went in and had coffee in Danish at this little spot that a lot of agents went into. And as I'm sitting drinking coffee and eating my Danish, and I look up and I see a guy at a table close by that I recognized as the guy I'd arrested in Denver over a year ago. And what I also knew is that he was currently an escaped federal prisoner. So it was kind of funny. I won't mention his name, the other agent. I said, John, I know the guy at the next table over there is an escaped federal prisoner. So John immediately, he's working with a young agent. John was much more experienced than I. He said, what are you talking about? He wasn't a reactive agent. He literally thought I was crazy. I said, John, I arrested the guy in Denver. The guy at the table, 2 tables away, is an escaped federal prisoner. He escaped from one of the prisons. He said, are you sure? I mean, he literally thought that his job was in risk, that he was out with some loony young agent that was going to end his career. I said, John, we got to arrest him. I mean, he's an escape. So anyhow, we arrested the fugitive. I apologize. I can't remember his name. It's not really that important. He was a escaped federal prisoner, and I did receive a personal letter of commendation from the director, and that was my first one. And then later on, there were a number of them in Los Angeles. I can't remember, I'd have to bounce around year-wise. Another good one, another good story in LA working bank robberies, because it kind of has a human interest aspect to it, which I found was really unique. I had a gang of bank robbers, all heroin addicts, very active takeover bandits, which means they would go in, take over a bank. They were fairly violent. I was able to arrest most of them, but one of the main characters in the bank robbery gang, I had a real problem locating and arresting him. Finally, one night, I was out with another very good agent friend of mine, and a really super agent, and we were able to get a crazy lead. We were out, it was like after midnight, we were coming up with leads. We came up with an associate of this guy. His name was David. I know his last name, but I'm not going to say it. We located a motel in a San Fernando Valley that he supposedly was staying in. So Frank and I, that was the other agent, we hit the motel in the valley, kicked in the front door of the motel room, and as we entered the room, the fugitive darted into the bathroom. So since it was my case, I went in first. I then kicked the bathroom door open, and the fugitive had a gun in his hand. Now this is where it really becomes interesting and leads to a story down the line. For some reason, I did not take the gun as a threat to me. Matter of fact, my thought was that he was going to possibly commit suicide. Anyhow, I took the gun away from the Adam Henry, and the case was concluded. Ultimately, I received another personal letter for arresting that group of bank robbers and arresting this specific bank robber. Now, interestingly enough, this one that I'm talking about, David, came from a fairly good family and had a girlfriend or wife that was really, fairly stable in the community. Many, many years later, and I don't have any idea, 8 to 10 years later, I'm sitting in the office, which is somewhat unusual because agents don't spend a lot of time in the office generally. And I get a call up at reception that someone wants to meet with me. So I go up to reception, and who is there but this former bank robber, David, who wants to meet with me. So my reaction is, oh crap, what does he want, So I take him into an interview room and sit him down, and I ask, okay, what do you want? Why are you here? And it was kind of interesting. One of the most unique experiences in my career. He said, Mr. Hitch, I just want to thank you for not shooting me. That I've turned my life around. I've become a stable member of society. I have a job, I have a wife, I have children. And it was all true, by the way. He wasn't blowing smoke. I verified it subsequently. It was literally an interesting situation because there were a handful of agents, not many by the way, that actually criticized me for not shooting him. And it's not like, in my experience in the FBI, was I somewhat I was not reluctant. I was not considered a non-aggressive agent. Matter of fact, the opposite. That was probably I was considered an aggressive. But for some reason, I didn't think he was going to shoot me. And the gun wasn't pointed at me, by the way, when I took it away from him. Anyhow, it's kind of that was one of my bank robbery cases, and a letter of commendation that I received from the director.
Okay. So later on, you become, I think it said, commander of the FBI SWAT team. How does it come to pass that were SWAT teams common at the time, and if
no,
how did it start?
Well, they were fairly common, but I'm going to back up before I became the title in the FBI is senior team leader, but he's a SWAT commander. They referred to me as the SWAT commander. The SWAT program started in the FBI in 1973. The first agents went back to Quantico for SWAT training in 1973. I was the team leader of the third team that went back to Quantico, which was in 1974, or mid part of 1974. I was actually considered to go on the first team, but I had had knee surgery that year, and I was recuperating. It was very serious knee surgery. The knee was totally reconstructed in 1973. So there was no way that I could have gone through the training with the first team. So they designated me the team leader of the third team to go through. Now, what was really interesting, when we finished that training and came back to LA, that was about the time that the SLA, Symbionese Liberation Army, they kidnapped Patty Hearst, and they actually started to commit crimes both in the San Francisco area and Los Angeles. So when the shootout occurred in 1974 between the SLA and the LAPD and the FBI, I actually had been the team leader of a team that hit a house that happened to be vacant before the house that they were ultimately located in. They had left that house that very day, actually, and moved to the house, I believe it was on 54th Street. And so I wasn't able to participate later that day in the shootout, but FBI agents actually put gas into the house that caused the house to burn, because LAPD at that time didn't have incendiary gas delivery systems. So basically the FBI burned the house down in 1974.
And so getting back to the SWAT team, what was the SWAT teams? What was was there a big push that FBI needed the SWAT teams?
Well, that's really a great question. Before the shootout with the SLA, there was actually a lot of reluctance about the SWAT team program in the FBI. It was still in its infancy. A lot of agents didn't think we needed it because a lot of the old timers, which I was one of, by the way, it made a lot of arrests with just 2 or 3 other agents at most, and against a lot of bad guys. But what happened after the SLA shootout was kind of the defining moment that, hey, we do need the SWAT program. And although it languished for a few years after that, in 1979, the office decided that I was going to, the previous leader retired, and that I would take over the team. The team wasn't really that good a team. It was not well equipped. It was really not much in 1979. And what happened at that same time is the Olympic Committee decided that the 1984 Olympics were going to be in Los Angeles. When I took over the position of the SWAT commander in LA in 1979, I anticipated that it would be a part-time job, that I would continue working bank robberies, that it wouldn't be much of a change in, I have to put in some extra time, but it wouldn't interfere with the work that I'd done for since 1968. From 1968 to 1979, I'd worked bank robberies. Well, surprise, surprise. I mean, it became not necessarily a nightmare, but it became a full-time job. It transitioned from just being a part-time thing to something that, I had to work at. I got involved in bureau politics and dealing with higher-ups from not only the FBI, but the local police departments, chiefs of police, deputy chiefs, whatever, the military. It started probably in 1980, 81, that all hell broke loose as far as the preparation for the 1984 Olympics. And during that period, I became a full-time SWAT commander involved in meetings that related to the preparations for the 1984 Olympics. We actually, I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Marsenko. I actually went back east. We met with Marsenko, who was the head of the Navy SEAL team. I went to Delta Force in Fayetteville, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. We did all kinds of preparation, learning experience to get ready for the '84 Olympics. The FBI's hostage rescue team did not exist like in, say, 1980. The FBI's hostage rescue team was created specifically because of the 1984 Olympics. And one of the reasons for that was that the military actually wanted the job. Delta Force wanted to be the unit that actually responded to an emergency, a hostage taking, whatever, during the '84 Olympics. And the only problem with, well, there were a lot of problems, but one of the main problems is that the military guys didn't understand the constitutional aspect of doing law enforcement work in the United States. Matter of fact, one of the biggest hang-ups was during the preparation, and we were briefing the military on how we handled a case if there was a shooting, and we advised them that we would confiscate their guns, and we'd have to do the ballistics and all that sort of stuff on it to find out. And it was kind of funny. This was one of the big hang-ups the military had when we told them that we were going to have to take their guns away to do specific. It was like, oh, no, there's no way you're going to take my gun, and there was a lot of other issues. They just literally had no concept of what had to be done administratively to follow the Constitution internally in the United States if they were involved in a hostage situation or whatever, a terrorist attack,
Let me ask you this, from 79 to 88, when you were in charge of the SWAT team, did you notice a change in society in general in terms of, did you find that you were going out more and more as a SWAT team because society was becoming more violent, or did you notice any of that happening, or maybe not?
No, slightly. That period for me, from a standpoint of of the public was, the response was pretty good. I'll digress. Our SWAT team actually was able to respond around the country when I was the team leader of it, or the SWAT commander, including responded to 2 prison takeovers in Louisiana and Georgia, Oakdale, Louisiana, and the main prison in Atlanta, Georgia. The reason I tell this story, it sounds like I'm not responding to your question, but I am. One of my biggest concerns, like when we went to Oakdale, Louisiana, was what is going to be the community response to this 40-man SWAT team coming in and infringing upon your community? I mean, and what was kind of funny, it was exactly opposite from what I was concerned about. They literally loved us. I mean, they welcomed us with open arms. The community, the people couldn't do enough. And then later on, after that, the Marielita Cubans took over both prisons, by the way, independently. But after they surrendered in Oakdale, we then went on to the takeover in Atlanta. And again, it was the same situation in Atlanta. The community literally loved us. It's very different from, I think, how law enforcement is perceived today. And primarily, it probably started with Rodney King. But I don't think that law enforcement got a general bad rap after Rodney King. But after George Floyd, I think law enforcement generally today I don't know if I'd want to do it today, is the bottom line. And in the majority of my career, I mean, the support from the community was really outstanding.
Okay. Can you kind of give me an idea? Obviously, you spent a long, storied career in the FBI. How did having that career with the FBI and dealing with the public affect your family life and maybe affect your perceptions upon how you deal or look at society and people in general?
Well, luckily, as I indicated a minute before, or a few minutes ago, I'm in my 60th year, and I've had really a great marriage. It's kind of funny, sometime during the reason our marriage is a success, by the way, is because of my wife. The first 10 years of our marriage, I was probably a selfish, inconsiderate husband to some degree. And when I say that, it's because I was so focused on being an FBI agent and wanting to do the job and working incredible long hours. During the time that I led the SWAT team, for example, I was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for almost 10 years. There were very few breaks during that period. I would work every day, almost 6 days a week, sometimes longer. My wife, I often wasn't able to call her to let her know I was on a call out. She'd watch TV to find out where her husband was, to see. But luckily, I finally, after 10 years, appreciated what an incredible human being my wife was. And we've had 50 wonderful years. I think we only had one child. She's a dentist here in Boise, and she can also vouch for how busy I was as an agent, how many hours often I would, work around the clock, not come home at night. I'd be out somewhere chasing somebody. And there was never a problem. I mean, now, in relation to the second part of your question, as far as how it affected, I don't think there is any law enforcement officer anywhere that can't be somewhat jaded. I mean, when you deal with bad people, when you deal with criminals all your life, you look on society in somewhat of a negative way, and there's no doubt you're much more suspicious in your dealings with people. You are not as accepting, and it's a shame, really, I think, but it's just, that's the way it is. I mean, one of the things that people don't realize, I think, about society is most people are pretty good. Not only pretty good, most people believe in the Lord. They believe in right and wrong. The percentage of bad people in our society probably is less than 5%. It could be 2%, whatever. But in law enforcement, I think you have to recognize that there is this small percentage of people that literally are going to commit criminal acts as a way of life, and your job as a law enforcement officer is to get them off the street.
Okay. Well, Myron, I really appreciate this talk, and thank you.
You're welcome.